No. Hello, everyone. My name is Katie Vetter. I live here in Florida, and I teach American Sign Language at the college level. Tonight, we have a deaf panel. First, I want to thank Rosa for having me and for hosting this event. Tonight's event is a multi-generational deaf panel. We're going to look at changes in the deaf community over the last 50 years. As for our format, we'll begin with introductions, and I'll begin with Yari. In your introduction, please state your name, where you are from, your age, how you communicate with your family and how you communicate with the community you live in, a little bit of your family background, your current profession, and that should sum it up. We'll start with Yari. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Yari Santiago. How I've communicated with my family was mostly speaking orally through Spanish, and some of them are able to sign, some of them aren't. Mostly it's speaking Spanish. My family background is that I'm from Puerto Rico. I'm Hispanic, and currently, I'm an ASL teacher at the University of Florida. All right, Katie.
Sarah, your turn. Hello, this is my name sign. I am Sarah. I was born and raised in Florida. It's difficult to find any homegrown Floridians, it seems, since we have so many transplants in our state. I have a deaf brother, deaf niece and nephew. If I tell you our names, the last name on my side of the family is the Weavers, and many of us did graduate from the Florida School for the Deaf and Blind. I just joined Medicare. That should reveal my age. I'll be 65 next week. My family background, both of my mother and father are hearing, and they used gestures in the home to communicate. My mother used ASL and recently moved in with me. But it's so nice that my parents were able to learn sign language so that I could communicate with them. Currently, I work at Hillsborough Community College, HCC, as an ASL lab tech, and I am also a deaf interpreter. Not yet certified, but I do a lot of work in the area. I have taken the written exam, still waiting for RID and CASLI to revamp the deaf interpreter certification, which is my next goal. That's all for me. Okay, thank you, Sarah.
All right, hi, my name is Arlene. I think I was unmuted, so yes, I'm sorry. My name is Arlene. I was born in Puerto Rico as well. and that I am of a deaf family. I'm the fifth born. I have four deaf sisters, and we use Puerto Rican Sign Language mixed with American Sign Language. I moved here when I was really young. The work that I do is an ASL teacher. Um, and I am looking to become a certified deaf interpreter. I'm looking forward to that test, and it's an exciting time for me.
Okay. Next up, Jason. Hello, my name is Jason Hurdick. I live in North Carolina. However, I was born and raised in New York City, the Big Apple. I went to the Litzinger School for the Deaf. And I was born to a hearing family, and my family did not learn sign language. I actually was educated orally using spoken English on the mouth, on the lips. So naturally, my parents followed suit. To this day, they do not know any sign language, so communication can be frustrating. So it is sometimes an issue going between both worlds, the deaf world and the hearing world, where my communication does have to alternate. Currently, I'm employed at Clemson University. This is the sign for Clemson because of our mascot. This is the paw of the mascot. And of course, Clemson is known for their football team. We won season champions last year. I work full-time at Clemson teaching ASL, and I am also a certified deaf interpreter or CDI. I primarily freelance in the 3 adjoining states, and it's nice to meet everyone here.
All right, now on to Maurice, please. Hi, yes, my name is Maurice Ebenchuchan Jr. The chat is popping up and I'm just making sure. Okay, yeah, they were asking for us to unmute, and I don't need to unmute myself because I'm deaf. I don't need to speak. Either way, yes, my last name is Ebenchuchan, and I'm junior, MJR, I'm a junior, and so I have grandparents that are deaf. I have a large amount of deaf family, 4 sisters. Um, I've got hearing brothers, and then I'm one of the middle children. We've got um, of the 5 children, there's 2 that are hearing, and so I went to school at St. Augustine, the FSDB, Florida School for the Deaf and Blind. And so I work at FCD currently, the Family Center on Deafness. And I work with youth and family support. And so I've been enjoying it. I've been enjoying it. It's a good living, and I like being here. So I don't know if I'm missing anything, but I guess that's it for now.
Excellent. Who's next? Taylor. What's wrong with me? Taylor, introduce yourself. Hello, everyone. My name is Taylor. This is my name sign. I am a junior in high school, 16 years old. I do attend the Idaho School for the Deaf. I've lived in both Utah and Florida. And I guess last year when I was 15, my family and I moved back to Idaho, and we've been here a couple years. And yes, I do miss all of you a lot, Rosa and everyone. It's good to see your smiling faces. I currently do not work because I am a full-time student. I'm in high school. My parents are deaf. I'm second generation deaf in my family. I was born hearing, so prelingually deaf. I do know spoken English, and I also am fluent in American Sign Language. the reason I am no longer using English is because I have a progressive hearing loss. And with communication, that can be fuzzy for some folks. I might not sound like I am deaf, uh, but that's why I use American Sign Language. It's my native language, the language in the home. Both of my parents had 5 children. So I have an older sister who is hearing. Then there's me. I'm deaf. Then my next sibling in line is hard of hearing. And then the 2 youngest siblings are hearing. All of us use American Sign Language in the home, of course, but we also use English because we live in both worlds. That's me. Okay, thank you, Taylor. Next, Joe, you're up. Joe Ellen.
Hello, my name is Joe Ellen. Last name is Granas. I'm 67 years old, and I've only lived here a year. I just moved from Minnesota. And before that, I lived in Chicago and Detroit. I have hearing family. Everyone's hearing except for me and my brother. When I moved to Chicago, I became deaf. And it was from a meningitis occurrence. And so that's what the reason that caused my deafness. Eventually, with the decisions for education and everything, we weren't really sure what school that I was going to be put in. And so they tried to, they put me in a hearing class. I was able to graduate. I was able to get a job and work until I retired. So I was in that job for 45 years, and now I've moved here, and this is where I am now.
Great. Thank you so much. Did I get everyone? Oh, no, last but not least, Patty.
Good
Good
evening.
afternoon. My name is Patty Sanchez. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. I was born hearing, and then later, around the age of 7, began to lose my hearing. I attended public school and never learned sign language until much later in life. Now, both of my parents are hearing. I don't have any siblings. I am an only child. Currently, I work for a nonprofit organization as a job coach, where I assist deaf and hard of hearing individuals in finding gainful employment and the training that they need in the workplace. I provide that service for many employers in the area because many of them do not have experience hiring and working with deaf and hard of hearing people, and I want to see them succeed. Also, as I mentioned, I was born hearing and had a progressive hearing loss, but I was in an inclusion type educational program until I became hard of hearing. And then there were no accommodations for me, like a note taker or an interpreter. Looking back, to be quite honest, I didn't know anything about having those kinds of supports in place until I became a job coach. It was then that I realized that I wish my parents had known that those resources were available. However, I was able to be successful due to my mother's Puerto Rican attitude that you can do anything. Thank you so much, Patty. All right, Gigi.
All right. Hello. My name is Gigi Duran. My real name, my full name is spelled Georgette, so it's too long. That's why I go by Gigi. Other than that, I'm 71 years old, and I've moved to Florida from Boston, Massachusetts. I lived in Boston for 35 years, and I've also been a certified deaf and legal interpreter for the last 27 years. In 2015, I retired. And as for my family, the whole family was hearing. My parents were hearing, my older siblings, the oldest was deaf, my brother was hearing, second oldest. Third and fourth were all hearing. So they're all over the United States currently. And my mom and dad just spoke. Everything was on the mouth. It was oral communication. And then when I went to Lexington School for the Deaf in New York, I eventually went back to Fanwood in White Plains, graduated from there, moved on to Gallaudet from that point on. And, oh yes. And I moved here to help at the DLC with Rosa, with children. And I was doing that up until coronavirus hit, and we had to all isolate in order to keep everyone safe. And I am looking forward to going back to the DLC and being busy with that again. And like currently I'm doing a pizza delivery, and it's an enjoyable and different experience for me. I'm having a lot of fun doing that. So that's it.
Thank you, Gigi. Okay. Now, some of you in your introduction went ahead and answered some of the questions that we have for the panel discussion this evening. That's all right. I will be asking you now about your educational experience. What levels of education have you completed? What types of accommodations did you receive? And any examples of where you had to advocate for yourself, requesting maybe a specific accommodation and whether that was given to you or denied. When we look at language development, I'll give my own personal example. I remember being taught very early on to create a notebook of verbs so that I could study English and memorize all of the different verbs. So that was helpful for me in my language development. Maybe you had something similar, like a journal to help you study, a dictionary by your side. Those are the kind of examples that we'd like you to mention. Yari, we'll start with you.
Well, obviously my first language exposure was Spanish growing up. My parents taught me with reading and going to oral training at school for 7 years. And then I also went to a private school for 7 years. There was really no access. It was hard to try to lip read, and really that's the point. Like when I was 14, I told my parents that I didn't want to keep going in that direction. I wanted to learn ASL. And so when we moved from Puerto Rico to Florida, I was on my own. My parents didn't move with me. The reason why was they already had jobs. They were working in the judicial system. So when I moved to St. Pete, my first exposure coming into Florida was not having an ASL or English background. And eventually, because there was no technology and all I had was a Spanish dictionary with me, a Spanish to English dictionary textbook that I kept with me. And I was able to learn how to write. I would just read and study all these different encyclopedias. And then when I moved here, I pretty much self-taught myself English. And that it was just by the classes at FSDB that I picked up English and sign language. And I was valedictorian. Eventually I moved to Miami, the University of Miami program. for computer certification. Was able to work with that for many years. And then later on, I decided to go to Gallaudet University, get my degrees, and to focus on cultural studies, deaf cultural studies. That's what I've been doing. Uh, and being able to read and write English and Spanish, I can communicate in several different languages now. But sometimes I do see it to be a real challenge in English, especially. And I feel like Spanish is the easiest, and then I've got sign language. English is the challenge.
Thank you so much, Yari. Sarah, how about you? Well, as I mentioned, with my parents, when they found out that I was deaf, I was around the age of 2 or 3. I don't remember exactly when, but they had decided to hire a retired teacher from Boston, Massachusetts, who had taught deaf children orally. So I also was reading lips, had a very difficult time understanding communication only on the mouth. But my parents had hired this teacher. They had paid out of pocket for her services. And because communication was not working, they decided to discontinue that. Now, my father was a fisherman. And of course, he had his own boat at the marina. And there was a deaf couple that also had a boat at the marina. My father ran into them one day and kind of waved, and the couple invited them onto their boat, their cabin, and they began to write back and forth. And that's when he told them he had a deaf daughter. He asked them what to do for me as far as my education. And that's how I ended up at the Florida School for the Deaf and Blind at the age of 5. I remained there until I was 12, when my father decided that FSDB wasn't for me anymore. He pulled me out um, because my father, unfortunately, was racist. I don't need to go into detail with that, but that's why he brought me back home where I attended public school. And you know, the laws we have today, like IDEA, those did not exist during my time. So I had no accommodations like interpreters or note takers. I sat in the front of the classroom and read my teacher's lips. Now, I will never forget, I had a science teacher who had lots of facial hair, a pretty full mustache and beard, and he was difficult to lip read. And so I did have a friend who became my note taker for me. She was also a friend of the family. We grew up together, and my family knew hers. So she would often help me, especially in science, with this one particular teacher. Now, my grandmother also happened to work at my high school. She was in the cafeteria, and she actually approached my science teacher and told him about my struggles. Well, the next day I showed up for class, and wouldn't you know, he shaved his beard. He shaved everything completely off. And it was then that I could finally lip read him. I graduated from a public high school in Venice, Florida. That's where I attended school. After that, I got married, started a family. I worked at the Deaf Service Center here in Pinellas Park years ago. That organization has since folded, but my position there was as a case manager for DSC. And at the time, I remember it was brought to my attention that I didn't have a degree. And so the administrators there said, you have a choice, further your education, or you'll have to leave this position. That's when I went to Springfield College in Massachusetts. There was a small, um, or I'm sorry, I got my degree, my bachelor's degree there. It was an extension of the college and at SPC. And then I worked and remained um, in the professional field for 30 years. I changed positions. I did start out as a case manager, but you know, the burnout eventually got to me. And then I told you I am at HCC now, and I am a deaf interpreter, but 30 years working in the deaf and hard of hearing community, and with ASL and English, I decided to be an interpreter. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much. Arlie?
So yes, I grew up in Puerto Rico as well, and in a very small town. There were no deaf people to speak of, no access in school. And something that I did find interesting, that my mom's family was very supportive of sign language, a Puerto Rican sign language and ASL. And the family, but the father's side would support speech therapy and oral training. So I had to bounce back and forth between signing and between speaking. And my father's mother really was encouraging me to try out the speech therapy, the oral training, to go to a school and see if that would work. And it wasn't working. I mean, I wasn't happy. My father didn't want to uh, keep on, I didn't want to keep on just trying to speak at my father. I just wanted to learn some sign language by the time I was 7 years old. So when I went to that school, it didn't work out. I was talking it over with my parents, so we decided, hey, we were going to give up on all of that. We were going to move to New Jersey by the time I was 8 or 9 years old. And I entered a program for deaf children. It was a non-dormitory, so we would have to go back and forth from home to school. And that was when I dove headfirst into the language, as well as the association and learning the culture. And really, my primary sign language is more SEE, Sign Exact English, and PSE, more of pidgin style. And so, like, I eventually forgot like the Spanish language that I learned, the written language. And so Puerto Rican sign languages stayed with me. But then when I moved here, eventually moving to Florida and going to SPC, I wanted to become a social worker. And then I was able to transfer to USF to get my degree there. And I would work with domestic violence victims, and that was a very heart-wrenching type of job. It ended up not being the best fit for me. And so heading to the University of North Colorado, that was my last stop. So
Thank you. Jason, your turn. As I mentioned, I went to the Lexington School for the Deaf, and obviously their philosophical approach to education, oh, yes, it has changed over the years. I attended there during the 70s, and I recall when I was first enrolled there, it was oral education all the way. And I can remember being in the classroom, sitting in a semicircle with my peers and learning to read lips. The superintendent at the time was a CODA, or a child of deaf adult, and was fluent in ASL. We knew he could sign. So it was a very interesting time in the 70s. It was just around the time when American Sign Language was even recognized as a language, when William Stokey, the linguist at Gallaudet, really was researching our language and brought us, the deaf community, to the point where we are now in recognizing it as a language. ASL is a language. However, at the same time, we did see total communications start to emerge. And I remember in school, the teachers were able to begin using ASL in their instruction, but it was paired with spoken English or simultaneous communication. Even the deaf instructors, ironically, had to speak and sign simultaneously. So you can only imagine, it's an unusual expectation. They tried that for 1 year, and then the superintendent decided it was very honest decision and requirement to make the deaf instructors also SIMCOM. Now, SIMCOM, or simultaneous communication, continued, and my parents encouraged it as well, which was somewhat oppressive. When I moved into high school, my education did evolve more into ASL. The instruction was in ASL, which was grand when I had a deaf teacher. But with my hearing teachers, they still use simultaneous communication. So I had a blend of both. And some of the hearing teachers were pretty fluent and proficient in ASL, but that's with any teacher. There was a mix of skill levels when it came to sign language. So yes, it definitely changed the language and uh, supports I had in the classroom, but my parents pushed me forward all the way and were very supportive. And like I said, the Lexington School for the Deaf was a great school. Again, the educational philosophy encouraged all deaf that you can do anything you want and you will and can succeed. They did not expect anything less. And so the bar was raised high. And so I'm grateful to the Lexington School for the Deaf for my education because I do not feel that I was miseducated or deprived. I really credit the Lexington School for the Deaf for their philosophy and how they drove students to be passionate about their education, even in English. I remember getting assignments back that were covered in red ink as I was learning the hard way when they proofread my English, but I'm very grateful for that. As a result, I am a self-starter. I have I'm very strong-willed, dedicated to my job. I actually went to school every day on the subway. Like I said, I'm from the Big Apple. I mean, there was a school bus, but I chose the subway. And the reason for that is I had a routine. I would every morning grab the newspaper and I would sit on the subway and read the paper because I was so eager to expand my English knowledge. But personally, my favorite part of the paper was the comics and the sports page, of course. But I was motivated to learn. I was supported in my school. I was involved with sports. Oh, sports were very popular. Uh, State of New York has many great teams. And so I attribute my English skills to that too, reading the newspaper. After high school, I was accepted by both RIT or NTID and Gallaudet University. Now, I attended the School for the Deaf from age 1.5 till 18 years old. Lexington School had me my entire educational career, but my experience was much different when I ended up going to CSUN, California State University at Northridge. I was there for a year and a half, and I'll never forget the year I was there. Uh, we had a terrible earthquake, and 70% of the campus was actually damaged from the earthquake. I won't go into detail there. But then I transferred to Boston University for my post secondary education, and that was the culture shock. That was, quote unquote, my first time being mainstreamed. I did have interpreters in my classes and note takers. And even worse, sometimes when the interpreters didn't show up, I was completely lost. And that's when I really began to realize I had all the supports and full access to my education at Lexington School for the Deaf all my life. And it was definitely eye-opening experience whenever the interpreter wouldn't show up, which happened more often than I would have liked. And the problem was deaf people like myself were left without access to their education. Of course, the demand was, you know, higher than the supply. And so it really was around 1994 when interpreters requests started to soar right after the ADA. And many colleges and universities like mine weren't ready for all of the deaf students entering their programs. And I would say 20%, yes, 20% of my time in college I often didn't have an interpreter in class, which was very frustrating. It was a struggle, which eventually ended up leading to a protest. Oh, this is Katie. Did anyone else have a similar experience? We'll go ahead and go with you. Maurice?
All right, thank you, everyone. Yeah, I got my own experience too. I did go to the Florida School for Deaf and Blind, in St. Augustine. And then I went to community college. I got an associate's, headed over to Gallaudet to get my bachelor's degree. And like in every school, there is a bunch of different accommodations that were offered. FSDB, some teachers would use simultaneous communication, and that can be tough because sometimes the teachers are very skilled in sign language, but like when they have to try to speak and sign at the same time, it creates this differential. And then I also did mainstream schooling. Some interpreters were great interpreters, and then some interpreters were strugglers. And then when I went to Gallaudet University, there was deaf educators and complete communication access, as well as being able to associate. And just like every school had a unique experience, a unique set of accommodations that I learned from. And like, I really do give a lot of credit to my school, as well as my parents and the teachers, really encouraging me to read books, to really just get deeply involved with reading. And I found that to be very worthwhile. It had an effect on my education from that point on. And I wanted to know how to read and write English. I also wanted to I came to realize the difference between ASL and English, and eventually was able to incorporate both. And so just trying to keep it short and sweet, but that's my experience.
Thank you so much. Taylor. Well, hello again. So I'm a junior in high school, and so I'm still receiving my education. I have been to many different schools. I have often been the only deaf student in the programs, mainly inclusion. It was around the third grade that my hearing began to really become a struggle for me. And I remember my mom was the principal at the school for the deaf in Utah. And I would often go to school with mom, and I remember being able to hang out and use ASL with some of the other kids there. When I was 9 years old, we moved to Florida. In Florida, they did not provide me an interpreter. I was in fifth grade, but I did have an FM system where I had a receiver that I wore, and the teacher wore a microphone so that I was able to attend and hear what he or she were saying. I also remember that year there was a new deaf program. I moved to that school, and there I was able to get an interpreter. And I remember being really excited that I would have an interpreter finally when I got into middle school. But I remember the interpreter was quite older than me and signed really slow and really wasn't a language match. So again, my parents got involved, and then it was interesting because the first interpreter, I ended up with their wife, the second one, and still wasn't a good language match. Um, so I remember that I really wasn't participating in my IEP meetings or 504 plan, whenever it was time for those annual case conferences. But I'll never forget in Florida, they had the end of course assessment and all of those state uh, core standards exams. And I remember taking the test and I didn't really understand what kind of score that I got, but apparently I scored like really high in English. And I'll never forget my teacher said, "You scored really well for a deaf person." And I was like, 7.5 and everyone else is hearing. And wait a minute, is this a pity party? Is that how you view me? And then the interpreter, to make things worse, agreed with what the teacher said. So I, at that time, called my own meeting, my own 504 case conference, and just said, this setting is not working for me. I feel like I'm being oppressed. I'm being viewed as less than. So then I moved to another educational program, again, inclusion, had a different interpreter. And during sixth, seventh, and eighth grade, I was involved with FCD, Family Center on Deafness, DLC, Deaf Literacy Center. So those were good social opportunities. And fortunately, my education, the supports I needed fell into place. Um, my freshman year, I went out a little bit more. My sophomore year too, kind of outgoing, but we obviously moved too in the process. Again, I am still being educated, uh, mainstreamed inclusion. Now the principal of the school I'm at in the last 2 years has always kind of kept an eye on me. I feel like I'm a target. I don't know if they think that I'm going to cause any trouble or what they think. But I remember telling my mom, and we decided to call a 504 case conference. And yeah, uh, the teacher ended up getting really upset and angry at my mom in front of the students and everyone. And the teacher, like, ended up slamming her hands onto the desk and just felt very disrespected. That was my freshman and sophomore year, which was I don't know, kind of embarrassing. I thought high school was going to be cool and I really liked this school, but it ended up not working out. And then I ended up getting in trouble. I was getting yelled at. I was just being a kid. I was just here to learn. So my family decided that I would go to the school for the deaf after trying, the local school. That transition to the school for the deaf in Idaho, where I am now, was different. I'd always been a part of the deaf community, but never been to school full time, like at a deaf school, full inclusion. Now I'm doing dual role enrollment. I am still in the public school for some classes, half of the time, and in classes at the deaf school for the other half of my time. And I've enjoyed my educational journey so far. I've learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to graduating and moving on with life. Thank you, Taylor. Joe, would you like to share?
Okay, so I became deaf at 18 months, and my mom and dad were very depressed when they realized that. And so they got me those headphones, the big box with the knobs, with the receiver, and just trying to speak with mom and dad. And then when I went into school at 3 years old, there were other deaf children that I was milling around with, and eventually, I moved to northern Chicago. There was another deaf group, another deaf class that I came to learn how to use oral communication with, but not sign language. And so um, I had to wear that receiver and wear my headphones and everything and just keep dealing with that. When I went to seventh grade and then eventually into high school, I was the only deaf student and I had no interpreters. And so the teachers knew I was deaf and they knew that I was trying to lip read. And then in seventh and eighth grade, after that, I'm in high school and I'm still without an interpreter and still the only deaf person in that school. And so I'm just making my way through it all until 1973 when I finally graduated from that high school. I just was so done and ready to move on. And I had no connection to the hearing world. I was the only deaf person in that hearing world. I mean, I was aware of other high schools and other deaf students, but it was a very negative experience for me. Um, Having no interpreters, I survived. And I was able to get a job, but I wasn't able to go and get any higher education than that. I mean, like, my job would sometimes offer me uh, some classes through the workplace, but then I just did all that until I retired. But thank you, Katie.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you very much.
Patty. Well, like I mentioned earlier, I was born hearing, and my entire life I was educated orally. I always did not have a sign language interpreter at all in school. I do recall though, when I was in second grade, I began speech therapy and continued until fifth grade with speech therapy. I remember the speech therapist telling my mom that she was trying to encourage me to read more. She wanted me to read. And so every Saturday, starting in second grade until now, even every Saturday, I would go to the library. And that's when I was allowed to pick out three books. And that was to help develop my English and reading skills, reading and writing as well. Also, at that time, there was no technology like we have today, where you can just look things up on the computer. Instead, I had to use a dictionary. And I remember my mother would even ask me certain words, or if words had other meanings, or other words that had similar meanings. And it was very difficult um, expanding my vocabulary that way. It was frustrating, but I was very fortunate that because my mom was on the school board in New York, um, all of my teachers never turned their back away from the class. They were always facing me and never turned away and had their back facing the class, because they knew I needed to see their mouth so that I can read the English on their lips. And yeah, sometimes I would be pretty smart, meaning that I would always look for the nerds in my class. I wanted to know who the smart kids were, because look over, and I knew they would be the best note takers, especially if they were already copious note takers for themselves. And I knew they were the smartest one. And it's funny because it worked out beautifully. I always got the smart ones to be my note takers. But there were no other deaf and hard of hearing in my school, yet I learned to stand up for myself. My parents always taught me that being deaf didn't mean that I needed special treatment, that I was no different than anyone else. And so if I had to work a little harder, then I needed to fight for it. I needed to fight for whatever I wanted. And that's kind of how I carried myself throughout school. I have been an oral deaf person my whole life. My education in college was that way as well. I have a bachelor's degree in accounting. I have my MBA. I got my master's in business administration uh, with a concentration in human resources. So that's me. Katie? Thank you so much, Patty. Thank you. Next, Gigi, would you like to add?
Right. Okay. I grew up in New York. I was born in New York as well. And how did I develop my language skills? It was my father was a police officer, and many times he would show me the headlines. I would open up the newspaper and ask about what these headlines were, and he would really ingrain them into me, what they meant and what they were talking about. And eventually, I was picking up more and more language through that. I loved reading comic books as well, and like the pictures with the text, just that matchup. And then I did eventually transition into reading books. And then when I was in Lexington School for the Deaf, I just had this wonderful teachers. That was a great time in Lexington to be able to read and then to become used to reading, to become acclimated to it. And I told my parents that Lexington had become too easy at that point. And so I wanted to go to a more challenging school. And so they said, okay, let's head over to Fanwood. Lexington School was a lot more oral based at that time. And my parents were very oral as far as their speech communication. Um, and a lot of the students in Lexington were older, and I would see them using sign language, and I saw them mouth the words sign language at one point. They taught me the ABCs, and in 5 minutes I memorized the ABCs. And then after that, I went over to the deaf school in Fanwood, and most of the teachers, most of the faculty were deaf, and there was no need to call in interpreters. The hearing teachers that were there, 10% of them were fluent in sign language, and so they transitioned over to Fanwood White Plains and were so fluent in American Sign Language. And that was English was my primary first language, and then eventually I added more language as I was getting older, and sign language. And eventually I joined like some reading competitions, and it was just all of those years that I experienced a push to get to the highest level as I could. And like Maurice said, there's different accommodations per school. And I was lucky that I was in a deaf school that didn't need to have many accommodations, where I could just pick up sign language and be fluent at it. And that's my experience. That's where I'm at right now. I did go to Gallaudet, and there was required reading classes in there, out into the real world, into the working world, interpreting,
Great.
until I was retired. And I still read. I still read books.
Awesome. That's great. Well,
Yeah, and I'm also writing a play.
right. I think I still read too. Yes. We're always learning, right? Learning never stops. It's a lifelong goal for all of us. Okay. So we only have it's 7:30 now. Can you stay an extra 15 minutes? Um, I believe our interpreters can stay until 8, but is everyone good to stay over another 15 minutes or so? Did I miss anyone? Oh my goodness, Arlie, did I miss you on this question? I think I did.
No, no, I answered already.
Oh, okay.
I was able to answer. Yep, we're good.
Sorry. Okay, thank you. All right, so next question. Actually, it's twofold. Because we only have about 15 more minutes we can go. If you could keep your answer brief, that would be great. Please share with us someone who has really inspired you, or who has been the most influential person, or even most influential event in your life. And what changes have you noticed or seen in the community? What are the biggest changes that you've seen compared to your past and present? So if you could keep it brief, maybe just 4 or 5 sentences, I can get everyone. And I'll go around starting with Yari again.
Well, definitely my greatest inspiration was my mother really encouraging me to read and have education access. I credit that to my mom. Um, and really it was not only my mom, but also the family, the other children, friends, friends of the family. Um, but like especially someone like Rosa that was always picking at me and making me feel like I had to keep on going. So the changes that I'm seeing, not really so much in sign language. Like as I was growing up, I didn't have much sign language, and then eventually I started to pick up sign language, see it here and there, and then in Florida, of course, at FSDB, there is sign language all over the place. So after that, after my turn in FSDB, like I think it was maybe 1995 to 2000, and then from then on, I'm just seeing this explosion of American Sign Language in high schools and universities and college exposure, like crazy, all over the place, and really anywhere you can find that they're ready to provide interpreters, or there are people that know how to use American Sign Language. And then, like, I keep having my jaw drop when I get to see that there's more access and more signing than I've ever seen before. Like everywhere I go, everywhere I am, I see, like over in Gainesville and University of Florida, there's sign language programs and people that are signing everywhere. And it's just growing more and more. Like when I was a younger person, there was so little of it. And I see the ASL awareness spreading nowadays.
I agree. I think more of us are seeing people in our community learning sign language, so that's nice. Arlie, did you want to share?
Well, one thing that I did mention earlier was the deaf family, the ASL clubs that I was able to be part of, and those were a wealth of experience for me. Just to the stories that I was able to have and memories that I created there. And now I see a lot of them have closed down, but every once in a while there's an ASL club day, a lot less than there used to be. That's something that I have noticed. But really, my greatest frustration, let's instead of inspiration, frustration, I think, is in the field of work. Just how I have friends that are still struggling to get access to jobs, to get more exposure, to get more deaf people, more deaf culture awareness, and how they need to provide interpreters for their jobs to be able to better explain their job duties. And really, that's basically it.
Thank you. Sarah, would you like to share? My mother was definitely the most influential person in my life. She would never let me give up. She never let me quit. When it came to school, um, she made sure that I persevered and got the appropriate education I needed. After I graduated, I remember I went to work as a case manager at the Deaf Service Center, and I remember the administrator there was a CODA, and he was also very influential on who I am today. The changes that I have seen, I would have to echo what Arlene said. Our deaf clubs have definitely disappeared. I see the younger generations in the deaf community more relying on technology, but they're really missing out on a lot. If they could just look up from their smartphones, if they could just take a moment. I don't like that. Maybe I'm old fashioned, but just a moment of your time. Taylor's saying, I agree. I don't know if you can see her, but Taylor agrees. She's of that younger generation. I wish we could go back to the traditional duck clubs and that interaction. Okay, Jason. Well, the most influential person I'd have to say, oh, am I on? Is not necessarily a specific person. I would have to, though, thank all of the deaf teachers that I had at the School for the Deaf. They were all excellent role models, and I'm very grateful to everything that they taught me. And they just modeled that I could do anything I set my mind to. And that is why I am the successful person I am today. I've been able to achieve whatever I want. You know, back in the day, if you will, I have to agree what everyone else has said. I miss the school of the deaf clubs. I'm a former president of one of the deaf clubs where I lived. And I enjoyed going to the deaf clubs and learning from the older generations and the sharing and passing down of stories. That is how we keep our culture alive. But now that element is missing in our culture. Who is sharing and passing down those stories, those tall tales, those legends? We have to be a little bit more creative. I know I have tried to spend more of my time. And you're right, technology, we've got TikTok, Instagram, Facebook competing for our attention. And so I've had to jump on the bandwagon, to be quite honest with you. I decided to uh, create a TikTok, open an account, and um, we also have Starbucks. Those are ways to get folks together. We have a ASL night here. We all get together at the Starbucks. And the first one that I hosted, we had 300 deaf people, and we average about 300 every month. And that has become our new deaf club. Deaf club. We meet up at Starbucks every month so that we have that outlet. Um, Again, looking at the past and the present, um, we've had to rebuild, and that Starbucks has been where our meeting place has shifted. And it's definitely a sign of the times. It is a change, but it is with the new generations, we have to make those changes. Katie is saying, yes, that's pretty popular in other states as well. Yes, but ours here in South Carolina, 300 in attendance on average. That means we are starved for that one-on-one contact. Thank you. Maurice or MJ, sorry. Maurice Jr., go ahead.
Well, yes, my family had a huge impact on me, really, just with the communication, feeding me all this communication, just so in so many different ways. And yes, I do give credit to some teachers who made sure to communicate clearly with me and had a high expectation for me, set high standards. I give them credit for sure. And speaking of big changes from the past to the present day, I'm just thinking of social media. That's the largest change that I can see, and just like the exposure of the deaf community, uh, deaf stories being passed through social media. Now you're able to get this exposure through Facebook or through YouTube or all these different video sources. It's really great, but then it's also with social media, there's a negative side to it, because there's some that really don't want to go into the deaf community. They just want to teach something and they want to teach it incorrectly. They don't know about the culture. They don't know about the deaf tendencies. They don't know about real ASL, and it's a missed opportunity. So there's positives and negatives to that.
You're right. There are always those pros and cons.
Always.
All right, Taylor, did you want to add something? Yes. Well, what was the first part of the question? I forgot. The most influential person or event in your life? Oh, many of you already mentioned all of the positive influences in your life. I've had both positive and negative that have shaped me who I am. Of course, the negative ones, I wish I didn't have to say. Those have been a big influence, but of course, focusing on the positive is room for growth and positive change. Of course, my parents, they taught me both that being deaf doesn't mean anything. It doesn't matter. You can do whatever you want. Just like I said, uh, my parents, my father works at CSD, my mom is at the School for the Deaf, and they're both very successful role models that I can look up to. The biggest change that I've seen, 15 years old, so I can't really say I've seen the change that the others on the panel have. So, no offense, no offense. I'm just saying that you, not calling you old, no, but just I've noticed in the deaf community, my parents have shared with me their experiences. It is meeting face to face, but like Maurice Jr. said, social media is definitely changed how we interact with each other. I am a social media user. I use it a lot. And I'd always use it as a platform to create more awareness about deaf people and American Sign Language. I have got over 500,000 followers. And so I do use it as a platform to teach and educate others. And I'm not saying I'm using it for any fame or notoriety, but I want people to know that deaf people can do anything, no matter what. And even though I might have very intelligible speech, I'm still deaf, and that's just who I am. Deaf people are cool. Okay, so we've seen and heard everyone's stories, and um, I guess Taylor, if you could, if you don't mind, well, I can talk about myself. I mean, I wish I had had opportunities to be at the Deaf Club. I'm pretty young too. I have different experiences. Well, I remember at one of the mainstream programs that I was at, I decided to start an ASL club, not a deaf club, but an ASL club. And we had over 100 students that were interested. Unfortunately, it was pretty short lived, but, often people that have never met a deaf person want to get involved. So, yeah, I did have that. Okay, thank you, Taylor. Thank you. Okay, who am I missing? Oh, Gigi. Oh, no, Joe. I don't want to forget Joe. Joe, you're next.
Well, the greatest influence I have to say in my life was my mom, because my parents were divorced, and she really pushed me to get through classes, to get everything done, to get my job. And yeah, I would say my mom much more so than my dad because I didn't get to see dad very much. And now, speaking of deaf clubs and events and the like, as far as deaf clubs, it is very interesting. In Minnesota, I lived there for about 29 years, and I was part of a deaf club with it was the Charles Thompson Memorial Hall that is still in there. It was established in 1956, and then like I moved and I became the financial advisor for the Deaf Club, and that I noticed a much larger turnout. And then in 1992, there was this huge amount, like fundraising, a huge amount of people showing up for this, and just thinking after 17 years, I decided I was going to uh, give up that position and focus on the other jobs that I had. And now I'm seeing like with the deaf clubs now, there's not as much attendance. I mean, obviously, I've heard that coronavirus had an impact, but we'll see as it opens up again. I am noticing less and less of an attendance in deaf clubs. And really, I think it's sad because I was able to be part of that. I was able to be part of a touring bowling tournament group, and then just being vice president and being part of the financial group, taking care of finances in those different organizations until 2012, and really the bowling tournament I think is still going on, but it still has reduced attendance. It's in smaller scale, but it's still existing. I really enjoyed that, and we did apply for the Deaf Literacy Center, and we're hoping to be able to have more socialization with deaf in that function. Oh yes, and also yes, I also sponsor art and music culture in Safety Harbor. So this year it's not going to happen, but they're going to reopen next year, and at least by November, and I'll be there. But we'll have interpreters, and it's a deaf-friendly event, and so I hope to see everyone there. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Patty, would you like to share? Oh, the most influential person in my life is my mother. My mother was the pusher. She always encouraged me. If I were to fall, she would make sure I was stand up again. So I really love my mom and I'm grateful for her. The biggest change that I've seen over the years in the deaf community. Now, remember, I really wasn't involved with the deaf community, so I didn't go to deaf clubs. In Puerto Rico, however, I remember being a part of many deaf events. Like we have Deaf Awareness Week here. We would do Deaf Awareness Week at the mall. Of course, they no longer host that event. I have to agree with others on the panel. Technology has definitely changed us. And then us senior citizens, like myself, no offense, um, we started out with different uh, types of technology. We had our TTYs and then we had our pagers, and we've seen technology evolve, and it has shaped our lives a lot. That's where we see the change. I like having technology for work. There are a lot of different apps also that are useful. There are resources that are more available to us now. However, it's very frustrating, and I don't mean um, to sound negative, but there are still many companies, employers specifically, that are not deaf friendly. And so I have taken that charge to fight for the deaf community so that they can gain meaningful employment, so that they can have opportunities. And I have to show the employers that they can, these businesses. I have to, it's who I am. We can't remain hidden. We have to show them that we too can be successful. And I think that all of us, as children, we had someone that we looked up to. And I now want to be that person, and I want to create a better life for all in our deaf community. Thank you. Last and the best, Gigi, take it away.
Really, the most positive influence in my life is, I'm going to say, my parents. While they were hearing and they were thrown that they had a deaf child now, um, I do remember that I started walking at 3 years old, and I was late and latent in my different developments. So they wondered if I was deaf, and they found out that I was deaf. But they eventually, as they picked up on it, they really made sure to educate me and discipline me in the right way to go. The changes that I've seen for sure, as a 71-year-old, I've almost lived um, three quarters of my capacity, and it's just like 3 quarters of a century. I'm sorry, where I don't know, with the younger time period where I would just see um, that there were these different clubs, different events that we were able to have, different chats, different poker nights, and eventually they all closed down. I just, it was just like the deaf felt the need to be involved, to be with each other, to touch things, to be tactile, and actually experience things. And now it's like a disconnected social media type worlds or a virtual world now, where it feels like it hurts deaf culture. I'm not saying that it's a completely negative thing, but texting for short responses, hey, I'm just going to meet you over here, just send a text and that be it. That would be fine. But like texting for 2 or 3 hours instead of being able to use a video phone to be able to communicate. I mean, just now I'm just seeing so much that's like closing up, and just different places that we could go. You need to have a license to be able to gather there, and it's really affected me to see that. Like it meant so much to me, to those deaf clubs, and really for the deaf community, it meant a lot. It meant a lot for deaf people. and it was important to be able to get together and chat. And every Saturday, it just like um, to see videos or go to the movies on the caption night, or to go to the bar and just chat, and like the old and the young mixing together and learning each other's experience, and learning how that you had to work over with in the bomb factory with these older deaf and everything. It was just all of that starting to fade away really, I think, hurts the community. And that's just something I wish I could do to bring the deaf clubs back to. I think it's so important to the deaf community. I really want to, and especially with the young children, 5, 6, 7-year-olds, I would take them to the deaf clubs. I would. There would be conversations to match their age and everything, and just encourage them to maybe set up a junior deaf club and everything, so that they could run and really learn leadership skills. Texting right now.
I agree.
No, it's got some good aspects. It is good. It is good for sure. Texting is a blessing. All the time though, just your head in your phone. I just like see them that is the negative that I see, that I perceive, and I just wish the deaf clubs would come back. What did you say?
The Deaf Literacy Center has a place. They are more centered. I guess you missed the Deaf Literacy Center pre-coronavirus.
Oh yeah, no, that was something that I was speaking about, how I wanted to be able to have a deaf club to support the deaf community. And Joe Allen, Steve, Rosa, Charles have been working to try to get something going and to get started with that, like the Deaf Bowling League. And that's just like to be a fundraiser. It's just something like that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gigi. Thank you. Well, I think it's time for us to wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us, for answering the questions posed to the panel and sharing your experiences. Parents, I see your parents were heavily involved in your life and were the most influential people, the ones that encouraged you the most. I know my parents were as well. They definitely were key players in our lives, not just for me, but for most of you. Well, thank you all so much for your time. Thank you for our interpreters who were interpreting from ASL to English tonight. We want to thank the Deaf Literacy Center. Their next event is the Hispanic Heritage Deaf event. It will be again on Facebook Live. So watch for an update on that event and others in the months to come. As you know, you can find those details on the Deaf Literacy Center Facebook page. Well, that's everything. It's a wrap. Thank you all for your time. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great night. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.